morning, everybody. Yay, Friday. And we are winding down. We're beginning into the last chapter that we're going to work on. We're not even going to do this entire chapter. We're going to do the first few sections, take a quiz, and then we're going to prepare for your final exam. So we are really getting there. Proud of you. You made it. Or at least almost made it. You do have to push through, make sure that you're practicing and getting ready for finishing up the year. So that's really great. Okay, so let's take a look. We're going to remind today about completing the square and using the square root property. Now, some of you know this better than others, but let's just go through and get this under wraps because it's an important thing. So keep in mind that when you are solving a square, you need to do a square root. However, there's also a positive and a negative version of that. Please excuse the notebook paper. It just is the way this one is. So that's where I'll just leave that. Okay, so I have x squared equals k means that you take the plus or minus of the square root of that value. So for example, if you had x squared equaled 25, x would either be 5 or negative 5, because both of those values would give you your positive 25 as an answer. Okay, and here is that exact exam. No, not exact. This one is x squared equals 5. I fooled myself instead of 25. So when x squared equals 5 and you square root both sides, there's two answers. There's the positive version of square root of 5 and the negative version of square root of 5. So we have two answers. If they can be simplified, they should be simplified, but if not, leaving them as a radical is just fine. Okay, sometimes we need to simplify first. It is useful when you have a square in play to try and get the square by itself, especially if there's no other linear term that's in this. This is our quadratic term. The linear term would be just the x. So if there's no linear term in there and you just have another constant here, start off by trying to isolate that. So we can start off by doing plus 48 on both sides. And then that will give you x squared equals 12 when you divide both sides by 4. Then you can square root both sides, keeping in mind that there's two answers, the plus version and the minus version of it. And then when you simplify this, don't forget your factor trees. Okay, so we've got the bottom and the top in play here. So we've got your factor trees. We factor out the 12, which gives us a 2 and a 2. And so one of those 2's gets to come out and gives us plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. And there's our, where you're moving out the one pair of 2's. Okay, so plus or minus two answers. X equals positive 2 square root of 3. X equals negative 2 square root of 3. All right. Now, this moves on to a more practical type of formula, and when you use word problems, you do have to make sure that your answer finally makes sense in the end. Now, in physics, we use a formula from Galileo dealing with free fall, and it has to do with the rate of fall and the time squared. Now, in physics, we're doing it in terms of meters per second, or meters would be our unit, but in here a lot of times we think in feet. So in your book they're giving you Galileo's free fall formula in terms of feet. D equals 16t squared. You will not have to memorize this formula, by the way. This, if it was needed, it would be given to you, but we want to think through what makes sense in such a problem. So d equals 16t squared, where t is the time and d is the distance, just two variables, so it's a nice little formula. So what we want to ask is a question related to that. How long will it take for an object to fall 180 feet? So we can use Galileo's free fall formula for that and plug 180 in where it says distance. Distance is how far. So when we divide both sides by 16, we get 11.25. Now in this case, because it is a a word problem, our useful thing to do will be to actually take the square root of 11.25, and when we do that, we get about 3.4, but we have the positive and the negative version of that. Now, this is where we have to let our good thinking come into play, because it says how long is it going to take it to fall 180 feet. Only one of these makes sense, because positive 3.4 seconds makes sense, but negative 3.4 seconds, you can't go back in time. So our positive answer, 3.4 seconds, is the only one that makes sense. So make sure that when you do a word problem, even if you get two answers, make sure that you pick the one that makes the most sense in the context of the problem. And that's always a good thing, especially because you're going to be dealing with things in life. And when you have something in life and you figure something out, make sure that your answer makes sense in the context of the problem. Okay? Now, when we're going to solve a square, even if it has something in here that you could do 2x minus 3 times 2x minus 3, don't be too quick to want to use FOIL and multiply that out, because we have a square that's isolated, so we can go ahead and just square root both sides and give ourselves two answers. So 2x minus 3 equals the square root of 18, or it equals the negative the square root of 18. So two different values here. Each one of those needs to get solved then. Square root of 18 can be simplified, so you want to do that. But then you need to add 3 to both sides, and you need to divide both sides by 2. And that gives you one of your correct answers. Okay, the other thing that happens, still 3 square root of 2 is a simplified version of square root of 18. You add 3 to both sides, and you divide by 2. And I want you to notice the difference between the answers is there's a plus over here, and there's a minus over here. Both of them are as simplified as you can get. You don't have to split this into two fractions because neither one of them is going to reduce anyway. But do make sure that you have two separate answers for a problem such as this. But it's a nice little trick to be able to square root it rather than having to move it over and multiply it out and use quadratic formulas. So when you have a binomial squared, that's just really, really helpful. Okay, so what that brings us to, I know that you remember from Algebra 2, you should have had completing the square. So we want to go back and just kind of hit this again, that in order to solve a problem, a lot of times what you can do is you can complete the square, and that's a really good strategy. So let's go over completing the square and the processes to do that. I know some people were better and some were not as good at completing the square. And for those of you headed straight to college and you need to take your placement exam, this could very well show up on it. So this is good for us to go back over at this point. For those of you heading for SATs next year, once again, these things are good for you, or for ACTs and or those type of things as well. So solving by completing the square means that we need to make a perfect square on one side so we can use that square root property. So we want to move over the 10. We move it over because you're allowed to subtract the same thing from both sides. A lot of people don't like when we use the word move over, but I know that's how a lot of people think. But you have to remember why you're moving it over. You're moving it over because it's already okay to subtract the same thing from both sides. We leave a gap. And then you need to figure out what goes here to make a perfect square. Our process is to take the coefficient of the x, divide it by 2, and square it. B is our coefficient of the x. We're going to fill that gap with 8 over 2 squared. 8 over 2 is 4. 4 squared is 16. So because you always have to do the same thing to both sides, we need to add 16 to both sides of this equation. And when we do, we end up with x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 6. And the whole point to completing the square is to make a perfect square. When we factor it, we get x plus 4 squared. Now here's an interesting fun fact. The fun fact is that b over 2 is always going to be this number that goes right here. So you don't have to spend a lot of time factoring. All you have to do is take that b over 2 number, that 4, and put it right here. And this is your factored form. Now we use that property that we just said. We need to square root both sides, but realize there's a positive and a negative version. So x plus 4 equals positive or negative 6. And then subtract 4 from both sides. So your answers are x equals negative 4 plus square root 6 and x equals negative 4 minus square root 6. Now, since it can't simplify, that means that we leave it alone like this. But if square root 6 were a number that did simplify, then you would have to actually do the two problems and find the two separate answers. So make sure that you're prepared to do either. Okay, so we're going to solve this one by completing the square. So this is the same process. We're just going over a few so that you get the hang of it. All right, you should probably try to do this on your own. We make a gap, add 1 to both sides, and make a gap. This over 2 squared. 5 over 2 squared gives you 25 over 4. That gives you the number you're going to add to both sides. 1 plus 25 over 4 is 4 over 4 plus 25 over 4 gives you 29 over 4. Then you square root both sides. Square root of 4 is 2. That gives us a 2 in the denominator, which is super convenient because we really needed to have these denominators match anyway. And to make it a simpler thing in the end, we take away 5 over 2 from both sides. And what you can do then is, since they're common denominators, is you can combine it like this. Negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 29 over 2. Now on your last test, what you probably noticed was there was a lot of blanks to fill in with numbers. Makes it easier than having you have to write all those square roots and whatnot. So I will do the same thing on this, is try to make it so your answer entering is not as complicated as all of those square roots and things that you had to deal with in the last one. Okay, moving right along. Solve this other one by completing the square. Now we have a problem with this one. Oops. The problem that we have with this one is we've got this 2 out front. So even after we move this over by adding 5 to both sides, we have to get rid of this 2. So in order to get rid of that 2, you need to divide both sides by 2. When you divide both sides by 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1. 4 divided by 2 is 2. This one's 5/2. So to make this work, you need to add something in there. So you need to take negative 2 over 2 squared, which gives you a 1. Okay, b is negative 2. So negative 2 over 2 squared gives you 1. So we're adding 1 to both sides. We're adding 2 over 2 to both sides. This gives you 7/2. This one's x minus 1 squared. Remember I said that the easiest way is to think of this divided by 2 goes directly here. And also, if you did multiply this out, x minus 1 times x minus 1 gives you that. So that's your way to make sure you did it right. Then plus or minus 7/2 x minus 1 equals plus or minus 7 over square root of 2. Now the interesting thing here is our square root 2 doesn't square root easily. So what do we do about that? We need to make sure we rationalize the denominator from before. You have a square root 2, you have a square root 2. That's going to give you a square root 14 in the numerator. We still have our plus or minus. And our final step is to add 1. Okay, so you can't just leave the square root in the denominator. We don't have common denominators. You don't have to combine it. You can leave it separate like this. Okay, but we have 1 plus square root of 14 over 2, 1 minus square root of 14 over 2. Okay. All right, sometimes we get complex numbers. Okay, so we have x squared equals negative 15. So when you try to square root that, we get the square root of negative 15, plus or minus. But we know that whenever we have the square root of a negative, that's an imaginary. So plus or minus I square root 15. And that is two completely different answers. Plus that, minus that. Let's look at another one. Because sometimes it does come out to be something solvable. So x plus 2 equals negative square root 16. We're going to square root both sides. But it's two answers. So we have 4i or negative 4i. And then we can subtract 2 from both sides and get our final answer. Negative 2 plus or minus 4i. And then just one more. Okay, this one, just one more for you to practice. Try this one, put it on pause, do it by completing the square, and then we'll talk about the answer. Okay, now that you've done that, we can talk about the answer. We have to take the 7, leave a gap, 2 divided by 2, 1. X plus 1 squared, then plus or minus the square root of 6, the I comes out, and then subtract 1 from both sides, and you have your answer. All right, so that's that. I will leave you to doing what you need to do in order to finish your day off. Now, Friday afternoon, here we are, and we are not going to say work on your assignment 73 right now. You have a work day on Monday so that you can just spend that day not watching another video and just working on assignment 73. So that's good. Have a good Friday. Enjoy yourself, and God bless you. Have a great day.